Everybody sit down, okay, all rise. Repeat the, what is that? Repeat the oath of the man. I'm a man, I can change if I have to, I guess. Yeah. Canadian thing. We're all set over there? Okay, we're good to go. So this is my little talk, and I call it Lost Along the Way. Or what I've learned about roots the hard way. So, to get started, just a little bit about me. Byterock on CPAN and most other places. Been playing with Perl since the early 90s. Basically only full-time with Perl since 2005, and you'll hear that part of the story. I think it's my 3rd Swiss Perl workshop and my 10th Perl event. Tried to present at most of them. So basically we'll ask the question, what is a root? So if you're not careful and you don't follow the routes, this might be your 3-star Alpine hotel in Switzerland. Don't laugh, I stayed there a night. So, basically it gets you from point A to point B. Now, being good citizens of the world, all of us today should have used this, which is what? The rail train of Switzerland, to get to here today, right? And of course that, all of us can figure that one out. But, and basically anyone can follow that route. But some of us can follow routes like these. Anybody know what that is? No? Well, if you followed that, you'd go up this. Right? Both are a standard, both are routes. You have to know what you're doing with each of them. Anyway. And I was pondering this, and I was doing lots of research on it and looking up stuff and trying to find information. And I was wondering what was the real first route in the computing world. And I figured it was email. Of course, this started in MIT when you had one computer. You would send an email message to the other guy's computer on the same network. It actually had to be connected to each other. And when the guy started his box the next day, if he had installed the program, the message would appear once. It's a start. At that time, I was in diapers, just to give you the technical story. By about 1969, we actually saw the first computer-to-computer email. Again, that was the U.S. military with DARPAG, or whatever they call it, talking to their computers, sending mail back at each other. And in 1969, I actually watched the first moon landing. I remember that, just in black and white, getting woken up at 3 in the morning by my dad to watch it, because he was in the Air Force and everybody had to watch it. And in 1972, a chap called Ray Tomlinson came along and came up with this. Me at some computer message, which I'm sure we're all familiar with today. You know, it's going way back to 1972. So to me, that was the first real route on a computer, because it was very direct and got what you wanted to somebody else, so they gave you what you wanted. And that time I listened to Nixon's resignation speech on the radio, stayed up late to listen to that. Basically, we get into this world, we get into this sort of situation where I need to get my stuff. You remember that George Carlin one, stuff, you know. Find it, can't find it, need it. I never seem to find the stuff I need. And that was the basic need for people to communicate across computers. So go from this computer to that computer and back and forth. So basically, it's a small history of getting stuff. And of course, we had many ways of getting stuff in the old days. Some of us old guys remember that one. Anyone remember that one? Unix guys. How about that one? PIP, Peripheral Interchange Program. CPM 80, CPM. That was that little microcomputer stuff. CPM. TTY, of course. Right? Kermit, anyone remember Kermit? Oh, you do? Hey, I helped write it. Helped debug it back in Ottawa U. It came from Ottawa U when I was there. The professor who wrote it, the guy did his PhD, was the guy that wrote it. Little office, stuck away. Never knew what happened to it afterward. I didn't think anybody knew that one. FTP, of course, has been around forever. MOP? Nobody knows what MOP stands for? Nope. Mail over the phone. Remember those acoustic modems? Plug it in. You type in,
They had a different name, I guess.
Oh, probably, yeah.
Acoustic though, I know.
Well, it's an acoustic coupling modem, yeah. But you'd plug one of those in and you type in, if you had a digital phone, you could type in an address, a telephone number, then type in the other thing and would transmit those numbers to the other telephone as letters and on the protocol, and you had a little screen that came up. It was really odd technology, but it was a protocol. And RC, which is remote calls which basically became IRC, remote channel. Telnet, of course, everyone's heard of Telnet. And the stuff was out there. People had stuff on computers here, there, everywhere. Dunk, dunk. We all had to get our stuff to do that. Everybody remembers, I'll put it on a floppy disk for you. And you come in with your 8-inch floppy, and he's got a 3¼ inch floppy. So, or you get them in the mail. CD-ROMs were a big thing. Right? Anybody remember 8-inch floppy? Old guy. But we still had to know, even if we had connectivity, we still had to know where it was and how to get it. Now, this is always a fun one. Telnet, escape character R, Microsoft Telnet, tau blinkinglights.nl. If you type that in, I can show it to you later, you actually get Star Wars Episode 4. Someone's actually typed it out. Gotta love the Dutch to make you not read stuff, but anyway. So the stuff was there, you had to find it. But of course, that just led us to wanting to have more stuff, right? We wanted to get more and more. Right? So in the good old days, people came up with something called videotex. And again, the old guys remember videotex. Minitel, if you're from France, right? They had their Antiope was their operating system or their standard, I guess. I can't even say that word. How do you say that? Bildschirmtext? Sorry, my German. Kommen Sie her, Fräulein, bringen sein Bier, is all my good German. BTX, okay. And they had their thing. Anyone seen one of this before? Nancy Reagan takes the subway. That was Teledon. That was basically the only videotex system that became an international standard. And that was NAS, which basically came out of the Canadian Communications Radio Television. Something. And that became the North American standard. And they released it as a free standard, da-da-da. And you could actually get stuff like that back in the late 70s, early 80s. Now, that was all nice and good, but it's sort of like these packages here. First time I saw one of these, right? You know what it is? You make coffee. If I take that to my friend's coffee maker, she'll look at it and go, I can't use it. The same thing with all these things. We've got all these standards. They couldn't talk to each other, or they didn't want to talk to each other. You know, it was just the standard of the time. It's like coffee. Just beans and a grinder and make coffee. No, you got to complicate things. So now we had a whole set of new problems, as I was saying. You still needed to know where your stuff was. For example, I actually remember where to find that Teledon thing, because I had it written down. So that they had a huge, weird system to do it. TD-Ottawa-store was the location, and then tilde, you'd have to tilde to get into the areas, and then you had to know what the file was, and then it's awesome.
So we had slashes and backslashes?
Yes. Oh yeah, and there was no real format to it because you could have these backslashes in front of those depending on what store you were at. It wasn't necessary. The store was a very special one because it was not a store as in shopping, it was a store of something else. They didn't think that out too well. TD, I think, was the only thing you'd ever find common in any of the Teledon addresses. And you also needed either one of these for Teledon, one of those for Telenet, or one of those for the British version. So you needed both the hardware, the software, and the skills to figure out where things were. So they did make it a little easier for you, but very expensive. And again, none of them talked to each other. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, these started to appear. If you had really nice parents, they bought you one of these for your birthday. You know, Mac, a PET, or a TRS-80, Tandy 80, right? I wasn't so lucky. I had cheap parents, and I got one of these. Well, after everybody else got something else. You know, VIC 20. Oh yeah, there was a good computer. And if you're really cheap, you built one. Exactly. You built a ZX20. I think it was 15 pounds when it came out. And the keyboard would last about that long. If you wired it correctly, right? I think the first one I saw that, a friend of mine put it together, and you had to solder all the keyboard wires together to hook it up to the CPU. So not many of those were successfully built. But that led to people wanting more and more stuff. People love stuff, right? So we got the BBS. And if you look at that, you know, everything we do today on the internet was on the BBS. Teleconferencing, information center, programs, forums. Of course, we just downloaded games and games and games and games as a young lad. And then the smart modem came up. That's a Hayes 300 baud smart modem. And that basically separated the computer from the card, or I think in the Apple case, the $1,200 card you had to stick in there to make it work, to go on wherever it was going. So that basically separated that out. And of course, we still wanted more after that. And again, it was still had the same problem. One BBS couldn't talk to another BBS. Some of them had email, some of them didn't. Some of them shared the same email system. Couldn't find anywhere. Man, you still had to know where your stuff was. You had to know how to navigate these things, find your stuff, get your email from your friend to get out where the fun stuff was. Anyway, still the same problem. But meanwhile, out in Baffinland, super smart people, they were starting to look at things like this. Anybody recognize one of those? Yeah. The early Xerox from Palo Alto. Hypertext. Ooh. Links and images all on one page. Everything you always wanted. And that goes way back, even this started in the early 60s where people started thinking of hyperlinks and stuff like that. And people say it goes back to the 1940s. Whatever. I'm not going to argue that. But we did have some apps in those days. HyperCard, anyone remember that one? Yep. That's Mac. And actually, they actually rebranded HyperCard and turned it into their app stack. If you want to know how they like to redo things. Guide was one, I think, on Alto computers. Stack was another one. That was a Xerox product. The only problem, of course, with this was you had to buy one of these, which was more expensive than the other ones. And if you had lots of money, you bought one of those. Or you went to your dad's workplace and used his. Again, they couldn't talk to each other. You had to flip these stacks. I remember going to the computer store, and they had a rack of floppy disks, and they all have a stack on them. You were selling these floppy disks, mailing them to each other, and that's how you distributed your software. You even saw that at one time. You even saw that in grocery stores and pharmacies, how they were distributed. Eventually, people got tired of not being able to, of being sitting next to someone who was using a Spark station and someone who was using an IBM computer and not being able to talk to each other. Then the boys, I think over that way, over in CERN, came up with the WWC, World Wide Web Consortium, in '89. And they basically just said, right, we're going to use HTML, SGML, really, subset, but not as useful. HTTP is an open and standard protocol for that stuff. UDI, which actually stands for Uniform Document Identifier, which eventually turned into our URL, uniform, not universal, which basically came up with this schema here, schema, authority, path, query, fragment, which you can translate into protocol, some computer, my stuff. And that looks pretty familiar, like me at some computer, message. It only took us, 18, 20 years to come up with that idea. So, got to think. And that's, of course, led to a lot of changes. It started the web, started very small, but eventually the web won. Right? And it basically really goes back to Roy Thomas Fielding's REST dissertation. I read it a couple times. And you actually see there where he compares all the different ways that computers communicate. And he figured out his REST was the best. And he basically gave us the inter part, or the software part, and the hardware part of the net. Actually, yeah, more the hardware part of how the hardware parts work together of the net. The net being, the World Wide Web being the high level stuff. He actually wrote that, the first version of it. Now you know why we're all here. If it wasn't for him, none of us probably would be here, and Perl would still be sitting in Larry's desktop someplace. And basically, his REST was an architectural style, not a spec or anything. And the main points of it, I'm not going to go deeply in here because I could sit all day, is saving resources, speed, caching, redundancy. Something goes off, you still have it somewhere else, you can get it back. Scalability. Probably the most important thing, you want to make it bigger, you make it bigger. And basically, to use the old joke, time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. In 1993, 300 baud modems cost $400. I know because I bought one. Stupid mistake. A multiplexer, if anybody knows what a multiplexer was, if you wanted to start your own BBS, with 1200 baud lines was about 10K. And site visits on the World Wide Web were about 10,000 a day. jump forward. So that's 93 when he started writing his dissertation. In 2000 when he finished, 56K modem card was about 30 bucks. You no longer needed a multiplexer to hook people up to your BBS. You know, the technology had risen. They had digital multiplexers and just, oh, here you go, give me a line. And site visits went up to 600 million a day. Disruptive, as Larry would say? You betcha. By 2001, 90% of BBSs and 99.9% of video tech services were out of business. I think the only video tech service that survived for any length of time was the French one, but I won't go into why. Anyway, Yahoo at that time was king. Everybody Yahooed, even had TV commercials. Google and PayPal were in diapers. They were coming up. There were 300 million websites by 2001, which is a 400% growth from 99 to 01, and 12,000 from 95 to 01. Right? I think there was less than 20,000 in 95. Right? So huge disruption of that entire industry. And again, we can ask the question how that happened. Again, I think it's really scalability. His REST design allowed you to add more, take more off the style, you know, and also the software suddenly became free. Linux came out, right? Hey, I was talking to my buddy the other day. He spent $10 for his first copy of Linux. Anybody know what a copy of Unix cost? 12,000. Plus, you had to buy the computer, right? So there was a barrier there for anybody who wanted to do it. And at that time, you really had no hardware constraints once you got that free software, because any computer could surf the web, and suddenly any computer could serve the web as well. And at that time, 56K was about the limit of most people's modems. So you weren't really limited by at that time, the bandwidth in most of the networks was quite small, but 56K could handle everything that was going through the system. You might have to wait 15 minutes for your picture to come up, but hey. And I think also his idea of using HTML, or what he called it at the time, hypermedia, really played off because it was very simple to use and very general. You could build anything. Again. And the other point being it was independent. Suddenly, the World Wide Web is independent from hardware. You just call up the guy down the street who started an ISP and said, can I put my web server there? No problem. You didn't need a box. Didn't need to buy somebody's box. Didn't need anything like that. That's basically how the internet won. Now to go into my sort of experience, because I sort of came into the web at about that time. And I would just call it very fragile, because a lot of stuff hadn't been developed yet. About 90% of the coding was by hand. In other words, you hard-coded all the URLs in the standard format we got in most of your sites. And everybody, of course, remembers what this is. A big whiteboard, sticky, sticky, sticky. And I don't think this is a job posting anymore. You know, a webmaster, the guy that would actually plan all those stickies and write all the URLs and make all the web pages. I don't know anybody's ever employed as that anymore. And a little while after the 90s, I can't remember exactly when, we got remote authoring because people were using GET to actually remote author on systems. And so then he added post, I think, in HTTP1. So you could actually put bigger than 1,000 characters down the line. But even myself, we didn't have post in the server we had until I think 91. So imagine doing 35 gets in a row to put a nice document up. Kludging. Then of course, then us programmers got involved and we came up with stuff like this to represent that. And I guess we had to do it the hard way. Everything was a kludge, basically, in the very early days. We'd pass something along in the post and get, and we'd use all sorts of little tricks like mode, delete, action, add, delete, modify, within the URL, or within the post or the URL itself even. And of course the roots were still whatever the Medmaster planned out. We just filled in the little programming bits. And it was actually very prone to anti-patterns, because you'd get, here's the add HTML page, here's the user add CGI page, user update HTML, and round and around in a circle. I think we had one website, 225 pages. Just dunk, 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 dunk. It's just what you had to do because we didn't have the technology. Things did evolve, of course. Eventually we had some structure. You know, JSP evolved into Tomcat. ASP dissolved into .NET, but who knows what the hell .NET does? It's really just an access. Java servlets were around very early days, but working with them was a pain because you had to know Java programming at the high level to actually make them work. And you're just printing things to the screen. CGI, of course, came out very early. I don't know if that's an architecture or not. Some people make architectures out of CGI. We still use it in my place. Again, everybody had their own way to talk to each other for remote processing. You had SOAP that was out there, still around, I think. Corba, and of course XML. And everybody wanted to use XML, but of course to use XML you had to pass other documents and yuck. Eventually, we evolved to a few years ago into what we would call RESTful services. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. And it harkens back to Fielding's original dissertation, but his dissertation really has nothing to do with what we think of RESTful these days, right? Except that it has no state, and he had the idea in his original presentation of using verbs, but he was only talking about get and post a little later on. He didn't have to put the patch of the get and delete. And it's a style. It's not an architecture. It's not a spec. It's a style. Now, to understand style, anybody know what that is? Right? How about that? Nobody knows what that is. Ah, an artist. This is a picture of a dirty floor worth $0. This is a Pollock worth $140 million. Style. Right? Style is something engineers hate, architects love. And engineers really hate it, especially this one. So I'll tell you a little RESTful story on my side. This is when these things first came out, just soon after the Google published their RESTful, though at the time it wasn't fully API. So it was a new buzzword and a new project of the day. Hearing the jabberwacky those guys were talking, we're going to use RESTful services and we'll be billionaires because we're going to corner the whole market with our RESTful service. Basically, the guy who wrote this lifted the eBay spec and changed a lot of words and turned it into a big spec of how the system was supposed to work. And we were doing it for a large enterprise client, about 9,000 plus. It was a contact relational management system. We won't mention the client because I'll probably get sued. Also to save money, it was the time of offloading to India. Everybody remembers those good days. So they sent the spec, about that thick and about that wide, off to India to be coded. Well, we were working on the other side, on this side. And it did come in 45% under budget once the spec came back, and it was 25% ahead of time. So, whoa, looked great. But they also wanted to be ISO 9001 qualified, so we had to test everything twice or three times and produce test suites. So then I came along as sort of a 9001 guy. I was a nobody, really, just a contract tester. And basically, I got this paper, here, do these tests. On the contact page, the user's contact page, check the create, retrieve, update, and delete the contact. Okay, fine. No, that went pretty fast. It took me about an hour or 2 hours to write the test doc and put it all out. And then I had a look at the spec that I was supposed to be testing. I go, oh, I know about that. It uses RESTful API for the data exchange, right? And it was using Yahoo Ajax, very early Ajax Yahoo to talk back and forth with the RESTful API. So I go, well, I saw post and I saw get. I didn't see delete or put or anything like that. They were just using post and get and all their stuff. And they were still using, mode, delete, mode, add, whatever. And, and I had some time on my hands, which in a Perl hacker is a dangerous thing. So I warmed up LWP user agent. Anybody know about fuzzy testing? Fuzzy testing. Box outside the box. Outside the box. I'm a real outside the box kind of guy. Who else would sleep in that in Switzerland when you didn't have to? So I did a little mea culpa. So I started with this URL, fake of course, ABC Inc. And that's basically what their URL system consisted of. Companies, 12 users, 120 contacts, 22. Standard REST type interface. You know, you got the different nouns, different nouns with the IDs next to them. So rev up old HTTP request. I said, no, let's delete this one. Contacts 22. Oh, then I select it from the database, 0 rows. Okay, let's go a little further. Let's go 120 contacts, delete. How many contacts do I have? Oh, I just deleted all the contacts from the database. Oh, let's try this. Let's try users. Oh, I just deleted all the users from the database. And what the fuck, pardon the expression, I'll go ABCD, select star from domains, 0 rows. And then the email flew. Boss to me, you deleted the whole DB. Well, yeah, I didn't do it deliberately, I was just testing. You should not test that. Nobody can do that via the web. I just did. Thank you. Then suddenly the India team got involved. Can he do that? Yells the boss. And the Indian team back to the boss. Well, the spec says it's allowed, and believe it or not, this guy lifted this directly from the REST API spec. Well, REST API style, which is delete all representations of the member resources of a collection resource. Yeah, little Bobby tables, if you know your thing. And basically, the end result of that, I didn't win that argument, and then I needed some work. But I did get my first job, real Perl job after that. Because I explained that to the boss. He said, that's good, you're hired. I've been working in Perl ever since. So sometimes a bad thing is a good thing. No, actually, the incompetent boobs they were. Backups, what are they? And we're going to production in 2 days. And who needs a backup database? Who needs a dev database? Just put it all in. I deleted the entire database. Whole thing, gone. Nothing. Like I said, there were 25 companies, 9,000 user accounts. God knows something, I just gone. Oh well. I think they eventually did recover, but they were rather over budget after that. And then of course I had to send it all back. The Indian guys, can't blame them. They just did exactly what, and you know, tunnel vision, exactly what it said. Delete everything under it, and they didn't ask for it. They just put that in the spec. But none of the guys on the team in Toronto and Ottawa used the delete, post, or get because they weren't in the browsers yet. I don't think IE at that time actually took a post, or the HTML would do anything with it. The server they were using would actually recognize it. But you know, LAMP WP would, yeah, sure. Hey, Perl, can't beat it. So it leads off to the question of how I kind of do things. And this is my road, my little story now, how I get my stuff. Of course, I love to use Modulicious since it came out. I've learned a lot using that. Made a lot of mistakes along the way. And this is just one of many frameworks that are out there. And they're all basically the same. The fun thing about Modulicious, if you look under the hood, it all says LWP Perl. So it uses exactly going right back to the first Perl on the web. And the one thing that all these web frameworks have in common is the black box or dispatcher. Right? You know, you got a request in, goes into the black box, and a response comes out. Right? And you can use these in any myriad of ways. It's the model. It's the view controller versus the model view controller. So you can stick it in a model view controller. You can make what's the other one? WebSocket system. Very flexible, really great. But, and to give you Mojo roots in a minute, it has a rather simple style. Method to a root, to a controller, to an action, to a response. So there's your URL. App, asite.app is the black box, or the app. And in that app, you would have a root, get welcome, and then to controller, asite, and the action is welcome. And there's asite, which is the controller, and the action, which is the actual sub, welcome, which renders the text. So it's fairly simple. And of course, the only problem with a very simple style, simple never stays simple, right? Because Mojo also gets you to do all sorts of other fun stuff. So that's because Mojo roots are fully featured. You can do anything in a Mojo root. And that means you can do all sorts of stuff. Like I like to call it URL diarrhea. You know, blah, 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 slash, 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 da, 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 da. No one can tell what's going on in that. And then my big one, of course, is back-end obfuscation. When you get wanked out code with 504 ifs making all your roots backwards, forwards, inside out, and no one can figure out what's going on, even me who programmed it. So both of those last two were stuff I've created in the past. I'm not proud of it. You learn, change, prove yourself. And eventually I got tired of the BBOM. Everybody knows what a BBOM is? The style of architecture? Big ball of mud. It's like spaghetti program, but more messy. Right? Don't know what's going on. When I de-obfuscated that code, the last thing, it took me about 2 weeks to figure out what I was doing. And I basically came up with a plugin. Plug for myself. Roots RESTful. Even at the time when I wrote it, there were lots of other roots out there, but I like my own style. And this one I found a little easier because, you know, I was familiar with what I was doing. And basically, it's my style, for lack of a better word. It's a bit of a split personality. You've got content roots, which kind of follow a RESTful interface. And then you have a RESTful API directly underneath the content root. So basically, you have content, and that content you can set that content to have its own RESTful API. It goes along with the modern day way we do things. When the page comes up, it's got a JavaScript or jQuery thing that'll run and get the data and fill in the form. So that's the way things is. A lot of the newer sites work that way. You know, the main thing of mine is just a hash. Right? The whole thing just works off a hash with a bunch of keywords. And the other point of mine, it's only two-tiered. Parent ID, child ID. If you start getting, big debate is whether or not you should start slashing that down all the way to the end of the database. But I've done a lot of database design. If you can't get to where you're going in 2 steps on a database, get out of the database business. Right? With those 2 steps, I could probably go to any well-built database. Doesn't really matter where things are buried under the tables. You should be able to find the parent-child of something in 2 steps. And of course, I follow the KISS principle. Everybody knows what KISS is. Right? Keep it simple, stupid. Spell that right? I shouldn't have. And I basically only have 3 root patterns. Parent, obviously. And under the parent, you can have inline roots, as many as you want, and child roots, as many as you want. And then underneath that, and underneath each of those, you have an API root you can create. And the API, of course, I like to call it CRUD for short, which is post, create, retrieve, replace, put. Everyone forgets put and what it's supposed to do, which means take this and replace what's there. That's always fun to test on other people's sites because they never get it right. Update, and of course, delete. So we'll start with my Papa root. Basically, all the content roots used by default, the key is the name, get is the verb, key is also the controller, and show is the action. So if I just add that using my plugin as a little hash, I'll get both of these roots. And go over project, get ID, go to project controller, and show the data. And same thing with the ID. It's all auto magic. Right? And of course, we also have the stash in the back end, so I can find out what the parent was, what that word is, and what the ID was. It's all in the stash. That's sort of given. Can't do anything without that. And what about the children, of course? There's a parent project with a child and a contact. Again, and this little hash would be these roots. And the same project one again. And project ID contact. And the difference here is that this one, when you have an ID under a contact, will actually load to the parent. Right? So project ID contact is a get from project contact. Right? A little different. And then project contact again down there. In case the controller is the parent key and the action is the child key. So I just find that a little neater. And because I know on my projects page, I've got a contact, I've got user. And again, the stash will find the relevant parent ID, child ID, and child. Then you get into the question of an inline. None of you are in the Canadian Army, so you will know what that means. inline root, which is just a little variation on the child. Sometimes parent and child doesn't fit, so we come up with inline roots. So you've got a parent, HT inline, home, and get forms. Again, you get HT home with a get, like that. These come into use. Again, in this case, the parent is the controller and the action is the key again. But you can always get cases like this, how to geek, and I want to control these forms, these tabs. Well, I'm not really going to have an ID in there. So I have attributes, so little extras I can throw into my little hashes to fix things up. In this case, I've got my inline root under my parent, and I stick in no ID. So then suddenly I get HT home, get HT home, or forms, get HT form. Quick and dirty, works really sweet. Now the only other problem is when you add attributes in, you give somebody the power. You know, old He-Man, if you remember that when you were a little kid. I never liked it. You know, the problem with power, of course, is I can change things around. I have the action attribute, so I can change from the project key using project as the action, and suddenly the action or the sub becomes list, so I can customize it. And then of course I can change the controller again. You know, action list controller is PMAP, and get a root like that. PMAP list. You know, no ID, we just saw that one. No root. In this one, if I did a no root on this, I would only get project ID with a get. I wouldn't get the root right, which comes in handy as well. And there's a few little more. There's debug, of course. Everyone wants to know what's going on when you're creating your roots. And that just warns in the background, tells you what your root type is, where your root's getting, how it's getting there, and what sub and what controller and sub it goes to. Stash, of course, we've seen that. It's just an ability to put stuff in the back end as it's going along your roots. API only. Sometimes you don't want the content root. You just want the API. It's basically the same thing as no ID, no root. You get no content roots on your stash, on your root you create. This is the one I call the Bronte sister, via. So you can do stuff like this if you want. Action list controller no root via delete. Okay, I'm on my content here now. And so I would get project ID and I'd send that via delete to my app list. And that's why I'd give it the Bronte sisters one, because she made that famous quote, if you give a man enough rope, he will hang himself. But, you know, you have to make your system flexible. I had to use that a couple times. Very long data strings that had to be entered in for searches. There's no way to do it on a URL and a get. So you put it as a post, the way it goes. Now we get into the great API part of it, or the RESTful API. I call it explicit because it only lets you do, it only opens what you tell it to open. So the API default sets the plural key as the name, puts API plural key as the controller, and again, like I said, only the CRUD verbs you define will be expressed. And the action, of course, will be the CRUD of the verb. So parent, project, and there's my verbs, create, retrieve. I get all those project verbs from the project, and then I get these nice API ones, converts that to project, post, API project, create, sub, same thing, API retrieve sub. Good way to close things down, and you never make that mistake the other guys did in India where they open everything up just because somebody said it could be. And the RESTful child is similar. There's a RESTful child example. Right? The only real difference in the API side of things is when you go project ID users, the collection goes up to the controller of the parent. So in this case, instead of going to API users, it goes to the users sub of the project. A lot easier in your coding when you're coding it, because obviously you're looking at the users of a project, you want some sort of collection. Right? Post, of course, it goes to users update and create. The get, of course, goes to user child, because you're getting a single child out of the API. And patch, again, same thing, update, delete. The RESTful inline. Well, the problem with having RESTful inline APIs is that it breaks the RESTful style really badly. Right? So I really just limited that physically to retrieve and update, so people can't do silly things. Right? So there's an inline version there. And I've opened up retrieve and update in there. Users ID, name, patch, get, and then you get into these problems where I'm actually patching and I have a get or update resume. Right? Because the action, you can't do it on a single action unless you figure it out as it's coming in. So it does get rather silly. Then of course I have little extra bits I can add in as I go through my system. You know, a root, basically you pass in run root to rule them all. In Mojo, I will create a root that goes under a authentication root, does all my authentication for me, and I'll just pass that in the top of my plugin as root, and all the roots underneath go through that authentication. Right? The root RESTful also returns the root node back. So if you're actually working with it, you don't have to do that. You have a different authentication, or even at an authorization level, you'll still get the roots back, and you can play with them then. Mojo is nice that you can run roots backwards and forwards in your code, so you can decouple them at the same time. I also have a config part, and I can control the namespaces that go into my controller. That's good, basically, because Mojo, in my opinion, kind of has a problem with namespaces. And there I pass that config namespaces into the HTML hash, I mean just the hash, and it's going to look for any of my modules under that namespace, and you can put as many as you want. It's going to cross namespaces, whatever, as long as you're careful and not cross-reference the same area. Then I have a few API goodies I throw in there as well. Version. You know, everyone likes to have a version on the front of their API, and that tacks that on the front of the URL. Resource prefix. You know, in this case, you might have an API that's beta, so beta v111 projects on the top of the URL. And then I also have a prefix. A lot of people don't like the idea of putting API on the front of your API in the namespace. So change the namespace to prefix open, and then we get, instead of API projects, open. Right? Now the other thing is, we're all programmers and we're all lazy, which is a good thing. That's why CPAN's for us out there. That's why I think CPAN's going down, actually, not because we're lazy, because we've written everything that's useful. There's not much else to put out there. Try to find something new on CPAN that's something that's been done. So if you have a boss and she doesn't like or trust plugins at all, you can call up this one I wrote up, and that will actually generate all the roots in detail. You run that, run the little script, get your hash, run the little script, zap, and all the rest, pages and pages of roots are all done for you in a single line. And you just plug that in and say, do you like that better than this one in the hash? And she gets mad at you again. And if you're really lazy and you need a site and an API or one or the other really fast, you go to that little generator, take your hash, type it in, and you can get an app class, content controllers, your API controllers, a startup script, and even templates, and all is based on your contact controllers. And actually write up a basic test suite of all of the API. So about 3 weeks ago, we had an API we wanted to test, and all I did wasn't written in Mojo. All I did was write out a hash of all the places we wanted to test and what we're supposed to click hit. Now all my tests were created, and all I had to do was fill in the actual URLs where they go and what to test. So that's how I do things, and that's the sort of brief history of roots in the world. Anybody know where that little shack is? No, I doubt it. I'll give 1,000 euros to the person who can find it now. And everybody knows what number that is, and so long and thanks for all the fish. I think I'm over or under. I'm right on time. Any questions quickly? Yep. You fine? Was it 12 we're supposed to stop? Or? Okay, I'm done.